Hey there, my name is Alex, I am the Silver Mont, and in this video we're going to discuss a simple topic, but one with a complicated answer. What makes combat in video games good? It gets brought up in video game reviews and discussions all the time. This game has bad combat, janky combat, and so on. But can we quantify good combat, and how? What is it that makes combat feel good? And before I get started, this video is sponsored by the BenQ Screen Bar, a workspace lamp that's USB powered and clips on top of your monitor, providing illumination for your desk with auto dimming to adjust to the right light levels, as well as color temperature and brightness controls. BenQ sent me one and it's quite a nifty little product. I have mine plugged into the USB port on my monitor and it works well. Now, on with the video. If we take Dark Souls as an example, the general sentiment is that Dark Souls 2 feels a lot worse than 1 and 3. Or if we compare games like Lords of the Fallen with Dark Souls, what is it that makes one so much more enjoyable to play than the other? Well, in my opinion, the biggest factor in good combat would be responsiveness. Now this can mean several things, but in essence when I say responsiveness I mean you press attack and your character attacks. We can break it down into response time, the time it takes for you to press the button, for the game to register that action and for your character to move, but also in the sense of wind up on attacks. At times, the more realistic a game is, the less responsive it can feel. Look at the classic example of turning circles. If you stand up and turn around in real life, you don't need to walk or move to do so. You can do it while stationary, right? In some video games you have a turning circle because the game itself can't differentiate between moving left and turning left. It can't differentiate between walking and just turning. Essentially you end up walking in a very small, or sometimes rather large, circle. The effort to replicate realistic movement can make a game feel slow or clunky or unresponsive. Just look at Red Dead Redemption 2 for example, a game where many people say Arthur Morgan feels like he's constantly wading through a swamp. Look at Witcher 3, a game that actually patched in a less realistic but more responsive movement system that you can optionally enable. Whilst responsiveness is definitely a large factor, perhaps the biggest factor, there's a lot of other points that need to come together to make combat feel right. Targeting or hit tracking is another. For example, in a game like Batman Arkham Asylum, when you press attack, it will do a context-sensitive action and automatically move your character to the nearest enemy. Witcher 3 has a vaguely similar system wherein Geralt will do random spins and flourishes that are, to some extent, out of your control. You can only control the context. Whereas in Dark Souls or Devil May Cry, pressing attack will always do the same attack immediately and consistently. You know exactly what will happen, where it will happen, and how it will happen. Consistency is naturally very important. Another aspect of hit tracking is the ability to move once your attack has begun, or to put it another way, changing the angle of your attack after it has begun. Most games have a system in place where once your attack animation has reached a certain point, you can no longer move or change the direction. You are locked in, so to speak. Dark Souls 2 has this in a very obvious manner, as you've probably noticed. Once your swing has begun, you are largely committed to that swing and you can't change momentum or direction. That rarely feels good when the direction lock is used too much. It feels a lot better when we can control the movement and direction of attacks almost entirely freely. Though of course we need some lock, but ideally it should only be right at the end of a swing. On that note, we have momentum and hitboxes. I feel like Bloodborne and Dark Souls 2 are perfect examples of this. Now maybe this is just me, but have you ever felt like an enemy is standing before you in Dark Souls 2, you take a swing, and you end up missing? Whereas in Bloodborne you hit them? I haven't analysed hitbox data or anything like that, but I feel like Dark Souls 2 has more realistic attacks and hitboxes for your weapons, in that you don't launch forwards when attacking, at least not to the same extent you do in Bloodborne. Your attack ends where your weapon ends, whereas in Bloodborne, your forward momentum during attacks is far greater, and it also feels like your weapon extends beyond its physical model. Disclaimer, that is how it feels to me, and I feel like it's done to make the game feel more enjoyable, without being so obvious that you're clearly hitting thin air but still hitting enemies. Again, I believe this comes down to realism versus playability. Now I'm no expert at real life sword fighting, but I don't believe most weapon strikes are taken whilst moving and continuing to move after, whereas in a video game, we want that total freedom of movement, even if it isn't realistic. It is what makes the game feel good. We don't want to be stuck in one place when we want to be moving. Obviously, hitboxes on enemy attacks can play a big role. We want those to be as exact as possible, so that we can dodge, duck, leap over attacks, evading them by a hair's breadth. We want attacks that feel well defined, not vague, giant hitboxes and shockwaves that hit us when we were not physically touched by it. And then we have impact. Attacks need to feel like they have meaning. This can be done in several ways, from enemies physically reacting to an attack, to hard-hitting sound effects, to hit stun, or even damage numbers. As to those last two, look at the hit numbers in a game like World of Warcraft. When you land a giant crit on an enemy, they won't physically react most of the time, but you will have that immediate pop of damage numbers that gives you visual feedback in a satisfying manner. And hit stun, I still don't really know if there's a mandated term for it, but what I'm referring to is, for example, in Wind Waker, when you hit an enemy and the game freezes for a split second. Attacks make contact with an enemy and the game hitches for a frame or two. It gives you visual feedback of your attack landing, combined with perhaps controller rumble and so on. Physics can also apply to the sense of impact and making combat feel good. When you defeat an enemy by swinging from left to right at them and you send their body hurtling off to the right, yeah, that helps. And there can be even more extreme ways of displaying this feedback too, such as in Ninja Gaiden 2, a game I still believe is unsurpassed in terms of video game combat. Here you can remove enemy limbs with very visceral and fast animations that are, of course, excellently handcrafted, compared to say the reactions in Red Dead Redemption 2, when you shoot an enemy and it causes a more automatic reaction from the game's physics engine, so that if you do the same attack twice on two different enemies, the results might be different in terms of how they react to it. Speaking of, can these slower games, such as Red Dead Redemption, still have good combat? I would argue yes. Monster Hunter is a game many people either love or hate, and I've seen people saying it has an unresponsive or clunky control movement system, and I would just not agree at all with that statement. I understand why some people don't like Monster Hunter and the way it plays and controls, but I don't think it is bad or unresponsive. I believe it's just down to personal taste. The characters do exactly what they are told. There is a high degree of precision and responsiveness in the gameplay. There is just a certain gait and style to the movement, drawing weapons, moving, sheathing weapons, and so on. This adds both weight and meaning to actions. You have to think about when you're going to draw and sheath your weapon. You have to play carefully. Or you can look at Resident Evil 4 and 5. People say those games feel slow and bad too, because of the tank controls. But again, I would argue there's nothing wrong with the tank controls. You might not like them, and that is fine if you don't like them, but there's nothing wrong with them. Functionally, they perform well. You are never hindered by the game's systems. It is designed around that style of movement. For example, in RE5, Chris runs faster than basically every enemy in the game. But it is something you do need to adapt to, you need to get used to it. Some people aren't willing to. When I played the demo of RE5, I didn't like the movement, because I was trying to play it like it was Gears of War. But then I went back later and I got used to it, and I think it's a great game. At the end of the day though, a lot of it is subjective. Even when you look at RE5 or Ninja Gaiden, there might be nothing functionally wrong with these systems, but you might not like how they feel. Conversely, there might not be anything functionally wrong with Street Fighter, but I don't like how that game feels or plays. But I do think it's a very interesting subject, and I'd love to hear what you guys think. As I can't tell you how many games I've played and thought, I'd love this game if the combat didn't feel bad, like say Skyrim, where combat feels like a skillless waggle fest. You can just walk up to an enemy and mash away, and it just doesn't feel like there's any point in it. How I'm controlling barely seems to matter. Incidentally, talking about some recentish games, I feel like God of War 2018 had a really well-made melee combat system that broke some new ground in delivering a new and fresh experience for a third-person, behind-the-shoulder perspective on action games. It's not my favourite game, but I think it's a recent example of a really well-made combat system. And a bit rare in that it comes from a Western developer. In my opinion, a lot of Eastern games seem to get combat right a lot more consistently than Western ones. Of course, there are exceptions to every rule. God of War, for example, has a combat system that feels far better crafted than, say, Final Fantasy XV. But again, big thanks to BenQ for sponsoring this video. If you need a workspace lamp for your desk that doesn't take up space and won't give you horrible screen glare, check out the BenQ screen bar. Thanks so much for watching, and let me know what you think down in the comments. Until next time, you take care. Ciao.